The UN is calling for a large-scale response to growing humanitarian needs in Syria as the country heads into the post-Assad era.
Almost 14 years of brutal conflict has killed hundreds of thousands and displaced 12 million Syrians. That's almost half of its pre-war population. While Syria's borders with Lebanon and Turkey are seeing a steady stream of refugees returning, the UN Special Envoy says the country's economy has collapsed and the humanitarian crisis is disastrous.
Nearly 17 million people are dependent on aid. The rebel offensive has displaced more than 1 million people, mostly women and children. The UN is calling for protection of civilians to be prioritized and international law to be respected by all parties.
It's also urged uprooted Syrians thinking of returning not to be pushed. Several European countries suspended asylum applications for Syrians this week in response to developments in the country.
For more insight on the humanitarian challenges facing Syria, let's speak now with Michelle Strucke. She's the director of the Humanitarian Agenda and Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. Firstly, with Assad ousted now and Syria transitioning into a post-Assad era, what are the immediate humanitarian priorities that need to be addressed?
First, I want to thank you so much for having me here this morning to talk about such an important issue for so many millions of people. This is an extraordinary and historic moment for Syrians. After 13 years of war, after decades of brutal dictatorship, many had given up hope that they would even see this day. So I just wanted to start with that. In terms of humanitarian needs, Syria was already in a time of its greatest humanitarian need since the conflict began, before President Assad was ousted. More and more Syrians continued to need aid because of impacts of economic collapse, years of war, devastating earthquakes that killed more than 5,900 people in northern Syria and others across the border in Turkey. And as you mentioned, almost 17 million out of the 23.5 million Syrians, which is about 71%, were in need of some kind of assistance. This is really an incredible number because that's the most people in need since the conflict actually began in 2011. And so at the moment, they are seeing incredible needs, including needs posed by the collapse of the healthcare system, with hospitals across Syria being overwhelmed by the number of cases such as trauma, including psychological distress among civilians and signs of trauma in children, which is what the UN has been reporting yesterday. There's an incredible concern about minefields. So unexploded ordnance is something that is really concerning, especially as people are returning to their homes.
Right.
I can attest to the fact that Syrians have been so eager to return to their homes, but then to do so in conditions that could potentially be unsafe. And of course, food shortages is a major issue, where bread prices have increased in Idlib and Aleppo by 900% in just 2 weeks.
So, Michelle, which leads me to ask, we know that some displaced Syrians are already returning. We also know that the interim prime minister and the HTS leader both encouraging all Syrians to come home. But the question is, what are they returning to? We know that they may not have jobs. They certainly may not have homes. Does Syria right now have the capacity to absorb their return?
As I mentioned, Syrians have been eager since the start of this conflict all over the world to return home. But that being said, it should be their choice. You've probably seen the news that in many European countries, I believe it was 14, asylum claims for Syrians were suspended. This is for humanitarian groups moving far too quickly. Syrians should have a choice about when they want to go back, if they want to go back. And there, of course, this is a dynamic time in terms of transition. The transitional government is not fully in place. There's still a lot of militias that are active. And the new transitional government, while they are certainly saying the right things about the respect for minorities and the return of public institutions and services, these are things that need to be built. As you mentioned, there is devastating infrastructure harm that has been done in Syria, a lack of hospital infrastructure. But I can attest to how resilient Syrians are in their development of local institutions, including one a rescue organization called the White Helmets that have delivered emergency services in some very trying times. So while I'm confident that Syrians will ingeniously come up with these institutions, you're right to point out how significant of a challenge it's going to be able to rebuild these places so that people can come back. And that's to say, too, that there are active hostilities that are still occurring right now as a result of countries like the US and Israel that are active. And so given that, it's really important to say to any country that's considering changes in their asylum policies towards Syrians to slow down and to listen to what humanitarian organizations are saying to be able to protect Syrians' dignity and their ability to go on their own terms.
Yeah, Michelle, it will take a lot of time, a lot of money to rebuild this country, with millions expected to return home, and the cost of reconstruction, I believe, is estimated to exceed $250 billion. I mean, where will or should the support come from, and what should it look like?
The support to rebuild is a very important question. I think it remains to be seen. Certainly, many countries around the world are leading aid donors and could potentially pitch in to be able to help reconstruct. But I think one fundamental principle that can't be left out is that Syrians have to be in charge of their own destiny. We saw this collapse of the Assad government happen despite having 13 years of various kinds of foreign governments that were involved in this. We saw Syrians taking this into their own hands and making this happen. So it's an extremely important principle and a principle of human rights to ensure that Syrians are in charge of and involved in the planning of any reconstruction. The funding that comes in, of course, should be therefore something that is allowing them to lead in the prioritization of how they want to rebuild their country. One danger, of course, is that just given the politics of what's happened in Syria over time, that it could again be left to divisions or be not supported in the ways that Syrians are demanding by countries like the United States, like my country. And so it's really important, again, to center their voices and to think about how to support them.
Michelle, is it also time to consider lifting, sanctions, led by the U.S., in particular, restrictions like the Caesar Act, for example?
It's an important consideration. There's been some news recently that at the UN Security Council that the indefinite the exemption to be able to allow providers to provide humanitarian aid into Syria when groups are listed as terrorist organizations was given an indefinite extension, and that means humanitarians can continue to provide aid. That being said, while groups continue to be listed, that does provide complications for humanitarian aid delivery. It means that the kinds of complementary goods and services that might need to support a humanitarian response are going to necessarily be restricted without licenses. So I think it's a political question by governments of, are these organizations still considered to be terrorist groups? Are they changing fundamentally? We've seen them give messaging about respecting the rights of minorities and about doing things differently. But this is after just having protests against them just weeks ago in Syria. So really, I think governments should be watching closely. Does their behavior match their rhetoric? And if so, if they do lift those sanctions, that, of course, could have an impact on the ability of complementary services to flow.
Michelle, understood. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time and for your thoughts on this very important conversation and issue of humanitarian aid to Michelle. Michelle Strucke is Director, Humanitarian Agenda and Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.